My name is Kira. No surname I care to claim, no family I ever belonged to. At 34, I'd spent most of my life trying to belong somewhere, to someone, searching for the kind of home I never had growing up in foster care across 3 different placements in the West Country. That morning, staring at my husband's phone in the suffocating silence of our Bristol flat, I realized I'd been searching in all the wrong places. My fingers gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles had turned white. The pale dawn light filtered through the cheap curtains we'd never bothered to replace, casting grey shadows across the laminate worktop. The phone screen glowed with messages that were ripping open every wound I thought I'd healed when I married Marcus 2 years earlier. Can't wait to see you tonight. Wear that dress I like. VXX. My stomach twisted violently. I scrolled upward with shaking hands, watching months of intimate exchanges unfold before my eyes. Heart emojis, stolen moments, promises Marcus had made to someone called Vanessa whilst I'd been right there, cooking his dinners, doing his washing, playing the grateful wife. The phone had buzzed at 6 in the morning, waking me whilst Marcus still slept beside me. I'd reached for it instinctively, thinking it might be urgent. Now I wished I'd left it alone. I'd met Marcus 3 years earlier at a colleague's birthday drinks in a crowded pub off Park Street. His confidence had felt like solid ground beneath my feet after years of instability. He was an engineer, stable, certain of himself, with a flat of his own and a decent salary. He'd pursued me with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in my life. After growing up invisible in the care system, his attention had been intoxicating. We'd married after 8 months. Too fast, everyone said, but I'd thought I was finally building something permanent, something mine. I'd been so desperately wrong. The flat around me suddenly felt foreign, hostile. Marcus had signed the lease before we met. My name appeared nowhere on official documents. When I'd left my teaching assistant job 18 months earlier because he'd insisted he earned enough for both of us, I'd thought it was romantic, protective even. Now I understood it was strategy, control disguised as care. I heard movement from the bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs as Marcus appeared in the doorway, hair disheveled, still in his boxer shorts. His eyes went immediately to his phone in my hand. "What are you doing?" His voice was cold, controlled in a way that made my skin prickle. "Who's Vanessa?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. Something shifted in his expression, a hardness I'd seen creeping in over recent months but had convinced myself I was imagining. "Give me my phone, Kira. Answer the question. It's none of your business." He moved toward me, hand outstretched. "This is my phone, my private property. I'm your wife. And this is my flat." The words exploded from him, his face flushing red. "This house is mine. You're nothing but a visitor here." The cruelty in his voice knocked the air from my lungs. I'd heard him be dismissive before, cold even, but this was different. This was contempt, raw and undisguised. "Marcus, please, just explain." "Explain what?" "That you're going through my things like some paranoid child." He grabbed for the phone and I pulled back instinctively. "You've got no right, Kira. No job, no money of your own, no claim to anything here. You do well to remember that." Each word landed like a physical blow. I thought of the joint account I couldn't access without his approval, the savings he claimed we didn't have. My personal account held £340, the pathetic remainder of my final teaching salary. It suddenly felt like the only thing tethering me to any kind of independence. I saw the messages, Marcus. Months of them. "Don't treat me like I'm stupid." His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. For a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, guilt, perhaps, or just annoyance at being caught. Then it vanished, replaced by pure rage. "You want to talk about stupid? You gave up everything to Playhouse, and now you're surprised it didn't work out like a fairy tale?" The slap came so fast I didn't see his hand move. One moment I was standing there, the next my head snapped sideways, the sharp crack echoing through the small kitchen. Pain exploded across my cheek, hot and stunning. I stumbled backward against the counter, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stood frozen, his hand still raised slightly, his chest heaving. I stared at him through the tears flooding my eyes, and in that moment, I saw our entire relationship with brutal clarity. The gradual isolation from friends. The comments about my appearance, my intelligence, my worth. The way he'd made every decision whilst convincing me it was partnership. This wasn't the first time he'd hurt me. But it was the first time he'd left a mark I couldn't hide. Kira, he started, but I turned and walked away, my legs somehow carrying me to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and slid down against it, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. In the mirror opposite, a stranger stared back at me, red mark already blooming across her pale cheek like proof of everything I'd refused to see. Somewhere in the flat, I heard Marcus moving about, muttering to himself. Then the front door slammed. His car engine started outside, faded into the distance. I was alone in the silence. And for the first time in 3 years of marriage, a small, fierce voice whispered in the depths of my mind, I needed to get out. I stayed locked in that bathroom for what felt like hours, though the clock on my phone told me it had only been 20 minutes. My cheek throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that seemed to spread through my entire skull. Every time I looked in the mirror, the red mark had darkened further, a vivid handprint across pale skin that would be impossible to hide by tomorrow. The flat felt different now that Marcus had gone. Empty, yes, but also somehow larger, as though his absence had created space I hadn't known I was missing. I ran cold water over my face, wincing as it touched the tender skin, and tried to think clearly through the fog of shock. I had nowhere to go. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. No family to call, no siblings to run to. The foster system had taught me early that family was a temporary arrangement, something other people had but I merely borrowed. My last placement had ended when I turned 18, and I'd moved into a bedsit in fish ponds, working retail jobs and saving every penny to put myself through a teaching assistant course. That independent life felt like a different person now, someone braver and more capable than the woman staring back at me from the bathroom mirror. I unlocked the door and stepped back into the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the cold laminate. Marcus's phone sat on the counter where I'd dropped it during our confrontation. I picked it up, my hands steadier now, and opened the messages again. The evidence of his betrayal scrolled past, months of deception laid bare in casual emoji-filled exchanges. But as I scrolled further, something else caught my eye. Bank statements he'd screenshotted and sent to Vanessa, apparently discussing their future together. Numbers that made my breath catch in my throat. Marcus had £18,000 in a savings account I'd never known existed. All those times he'd said we were barely getting by, that we couldn't afford a holiday or new furniture or even fixing the broken boiler properly. All those times he'd made me feel guilty for wanting to return to work, saying it would cost more in transport than I'd earn. He'd been saving thousands whilst keeping me financially dependent, trapped. The manipulation was so calculated it made me feel physically sick. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. A text from Sandra, my former colleague from the primary school where I'd worked. We'd stayed in occasional contact, though Marcus had always found reasons why I couldn't meet her for coffee. Haven't heard from you in ages. Fancy a catch-up sometime? Miss you X. I stared at that message for a long moment. Sandra had always been kind, one of those genuinely warm people who seemed to radiate safety. When I'd left the school, she'd hugged me tight and said, "My door's always open if you need anything." I'd thought it was just something people said. Now, sitting in this flat that wasn't mine, with a mark on my face that was already turning purple, I wondered if she'd meant it literally. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. What would I even say? "Hi, my husband just hit me and I need somewhere to stay." The words felt too stark, too real, like speaking them aloud would make this nightmare permanent. Instead, I opened my phone's camera and took a photograph of my face. The image was brutal in its clarity, the handprint vivid against my skin, my eyes red-rimmed and lost. I saved it to a hidden folder, something instinctive telling me I'd need evidence of this moment. Then I called the number I'd once saved under support services during a staff training on domestic abuse awareness. I'd never imagined I'd be the one using it. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice calm and professional. "National Domestic Abuse Helpline, my name's Priya. How can I help you today? The kindness in her tone broke something inside me. I don't know if I should be calling, I heard myself say, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure if what happened counts as. Whatever happened to you is valid, Priya interrupted gently. You don't have to justify calling us. Would you like to tell me what's going on? So I did. The words tumbled out in a rush, disjointed and raw. The affair, the financial control, the slap, the realization that I had nothing in my own name. Priya listened without judgment, asking occasional questions that helped me see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. What you're describing is coercive control, she said finally. The financial abuse, the isolation, the physical violence, these are all part of a pattern. You're not overreacting, Kira. You're recognizing danger. Hearing it named, validated by someone who understood, made my hands shake all over again. But this time, it wasn't just fear. It was something else, something harder and more determined. I need to leave, I said aloud, testing how the words felt. But I don't know how. We can help you with that, Priya replied. Let's talk about what leaving safely might look like for you. We spoke for 40 minutes. By the time I hung up, I had a plan forming. Not a perfect plan, not a complete one, but a beginning. Document everything. Reach out to Sandra. Contact a solicitor about my rights. Start gathering the resources I'd need to build a life outside these walls. I heard Marcus's key in the lock just after 3 in the afternoon. My heart lurched, but I'd had hours to prepare myself. I stood in the kitchen as he entered, carrying a bouquet of petrol station flowers and a carrier bag that smelled of Chinese takeaway. Kira, he started, his voice carefully modulated. I'm so sorry about earlier. I completely lost my head. It'll never happen again, I swear. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. Someone who thought flowers could erase violence, that cheap apologies could reset our relationship to before I knew the truth. It's okay, I heard myself say, the words tasting like ash. I understand you were upset. His relief was visible, his shoulders dropping. I knew you'd understand. You're so reasonable, that's what I've always loved about you. I took the flowers, put them in water, set the table for our meal. Played the role he expected whilst my phone sat heavy in my pocket, filled with photographs and helpline numbers and the beginning of my escape. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I locked myself in the bathroom again and took 3 more photographs of my darkening bruise. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with eyes that were no longer lost. They were awake. The week that followed felt like living in 2 separate realities. On the surface, I played the role Marcus expected, quiet, compliant, grateful for his forgiveness. Beneath that carefully maintained facade, I was building my escape route piece by piece, every small action a silent rebellion. I'd started documenting everything. Photographs of my fading bruise taken daily, showing the progression from angry red to mottled purple to sickly yellow-green. Screenshots of the messages between Marcus and Vanessa, saved to a cloud account he didn't know I'd created. Records of our joint account showing his transfers to that secret savings account, money siphoned away whilst he complained we couldn't afford basics. Each piece of evidence felt like reclaiming a fragment of power. On Tuesday, whilst Marcus was at work, I'd met Sandra for coffee in a quiet cafe in Clifton. She'd taken one look at the fading mark on my cheek, barely covered by makeup, and her expression had shifted from friendly warmth to fierce concern. Kira, what happened to your face? I'd rehearsed this moment, but the words still caught in my throat. I need help. And I didn't know who else to ask. Sandra reached across the table and took my hand without hesitation. Whatever you need. My spare room is yours for as long as you want it. The relief had been so overwhelming I'd nearly cried right there in the cafe. Instead, I'd explained everything in a low, steady voice whilst Sandra listened, her grip on my hand never loosening. By the time we'd finished our coffees, I had somewhere safe to go when the moment came. That same afternoon, I'd contacted a solicitor through the helpline. A woman named Helen who specialized in domestic abuse cases had explained my rights with patient clarity. Despite my name not being on the lease, I was entitled to spousal support. The evidence I was gathering would be crucial. Document everything, Helen had said. And when you're ready to leave, make sure you're safe first. Everything else can be sorted afterwards. Marcus had grown increasingly suspicious of my subdued behavior. On Thursday evening, he'd grabbed my wrist whilst I was washing up, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. "You've been quiet all week. What are you planning?" I'd forced myself to meet his eyes, to keep my voice calm despite my racing heart. "Nothing. I'm just still processing everything." The argument shook me. He'd studied my face for a long moment before releasing me. "Good. As long as we understand each other." I'd understood perfectly. The threat was clear, the control tightening. But what Marcus didn't know was that I'd already packed a small bag of essentials, documents, medication, a change of clothes, my grandmother's ring that he'd tried to claim as family property. The bag was hidden in Sandra's garden shed, waiting. On Friday, I'd returned to that cafe in Clifton and opened a new bank account in my name only. I'd transferred my £340 from the account Marcus monitored, closing it entirely. It wasn't much, but it was mine, untouchable by him. That evening, Marcus came home and announced he'd been looking at flats online. My blood ran cold until I realized he meant for a fresh start. "Somewhere bigger," he said, scrolling through property listings on his laptop. "We could move to Bedminster, get more space. What do you think?" I looked at him, suggesting we move somewhere new whilst carrying on an affair, hiding money, having hit me just days earlier. The audacity would have been laughable if it weren't so chilling. "That sounds nice," I'd replied, the lie smooth and practiced now. Later, alone in the bathroom, I'd photographed the new bruises on my wrist, adding them to my growing collection of evidence. Each image was a reminder of why I was doing this, why I couldn't stay, why nice words meant nothing when backed by violence. Marcus's laptop sat unattended in the living room. I'd opened it quickly, knowing his passwords because he'd never imagined I'd use them against him. The bank statements confirmed what I'd suspected: £18,247 in that hidden account, built up over 2 years of claiming poverty. I'd screenshotted everything, sent it to my new email address, and deleted the sent folder before he noticed. Sunday morning, Marcus slept late. I sat at the kitchen table with tea I didn't drink, my phone in my hand, Sandra's number on the screen. One call. That's all it would take to set everything in motion. But fear still gripped me. Fear of the unknown, of starting over with nothing, of his reaction when he discovered I'd gone. Then I looked at my wrist, at the finger-shaped bruises turning purple beneath my skin, and I knew the only thing more terrifying than leaving was staying. I pressed call. "Sandra. I'm ready. Can you come get me today?" Her response was immediate. "I'm on my way." Sandra's blue Corsa pulled up outside the flat exactly 43 minutes later. I watched from the window, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Marcus was still asleep in the bedroom, his snoring audible through the thin walls. I'd told Sandra to text when she arrived, not to knock. The message came: "I'm here. Take your time, X." But I had no time. Every second I delayed was another second I might lose my nerve, another moment Marcus might wake and discover what I was doing. I'd already packed what mattered during the week, hidden in Sandra's shed. Now I just needed to walk out the door with my handbag and phone. It should have been simple. It felt impossible. I stood in the hallway, looking at the flat that had been my prison disguised as a home. The cheap furniture we'd bought at IKEA when we first moved in, arguing cheerfully about which lampshade looked better. The photographs on the wall from our wedding, my smile so genuine I barely recognized myself. The kitchen where he'd slapped me just 8 days ago. 8 days. That was all it had taken to dismantle 3 years of my life. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling violently. Behind me, Marcus's snoring stopped. My blood turned to ice. I heard the bed creak, footsteps on the bedroom floor. I had seconds to decide. The door opened before I'd consciously chosen to turn the handle. Cool morning air hit my face as I stepped onto the landing, pulling it closed behind me as quietly as I could. My feet moved automatically down the stairs, faster and faster, until I was nearly running toward Sandra's car. "Kira." Marcus's voice bellowed from the window above. "Where the hell are you going?" I didn't look back. Sandra had already opened the passenger door. I dove inside, slamming it shut as she immediately started the engine. "Drive," I gasped. "Just drive." She pulled away from the curb as Marcus appeared in the doorway in his boxer shorts, his face twisted with rage. He started toward the car, but Sandra was already accelerating down the street. I watched him in the side mirror, growing smaller and smaller until we turned the corner and he disappeared entirely. Only then did I start shaking uncontrollably. Sandra reached over and squeezed my hand whilst keeping her eyes on the road. "You're safe now. You did it, Kira. You actually did it." But I didn't feel safe. I felt terrified, unmoored, like I'd just jumped off a cliff without knowing if there was water below or rocks. Everything I owned was still in that flat. My clothes, my books, the few possessions that were mine. I'd walked away with nothing but my handbag and the clothes on my back. "He's going to come after me," I heard myself say. "He's going to find me." "Not at my house he won't," Sandra replied firmly. "And we'll get a non-molestation order sorted first thing Monday. You're not alone in this, Kira." My phone started buzzing in my handbag. "Marcus." I pulled it out with shaking hands and saw 17 missed calls already, messages flooding in. "Kira, come back right now. You're being ridiculous. This is my flat, you can't just leave. If you don't come back, you'll regret it." The threats were already starting. I turned my phone to silent and shoved it back in my bag. We drove to Sandra's terraced house in Easton, a modest 2-bedroom with a small garden and a bright yellow door. She'd lived here for 6 years, she told me, since leaving her own controlling partner. She understood exactly what I was going through because she'd walked this same path. Inside, the house was warm and cluttered in a way that felt like actual living, not the sterile control Marcus had imposed on our flat. Books everywhere, plants on every windowsill, photographs of Sandra with friends and family covering the walls. "The spare room's upstairs," she said, leading me up narrow stairs. "It's small, but it's yours for as long as you need it." The room had a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wardrobe, and a window overlooking the garden. It was simple and clean and completely safe. I stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the enormity of what I'd just done. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know how I'll ever." "You'd do the same for me," Sandra interrupted gently. "Now, I'm going to make us tea, and you're going to sit down and breathe. Everything else can wait." I sat on the edge of the bed as she went downstairs. My phone buzzed again, and again, and again. Marcus wasn't stopping. The messages were getting angrier, more desperate. I pulled up my contacts and blocked his number entirely. The silence that followed felt like the first full breath I'd taken in years. The first 3 days at Sandra's house passed in a blur of administrative chaos and emotional exhaustion. I'd never realized how much paperwork freedom required, how many systems I'd need to navigate just to exist independently. Monday morning, I sat in a solicitor's office in the city centre whilst Helen walked me through divorce proceedings with calm efficiency. She'd seen cases like mine before, hundreds of them probably, but she treated my story with the gravity it deserved. "The evidence you've gathered is excellent," she said, reviewing the photographs on my phone. "The bruising, the financial records, the threatening messages before you blocked him. This establishes a clear pattern of coercive control and domestic abuse." Hearing those words from a legal professional made something shift inside me. This wasn't just Marcus being difficult or me being oversensitive. This was abuse, documented and undeniable. "What happens next?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "We file for divorce immediately. Given the circumstances, we'll also apply for a non-molestation order to legally prevent him from contacting or approaching you. He'll be served with papers within the week." The thought of Marcus receiving those papers filled me with equal parts satisfaction and terror. He wouldn't accept this quietly. Men like him never did. After the solicitor, I went to the job center to apply for universal credit. The process was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated, having to prove my destitution to strangers, explaining why I had no recent work history or references. But the advisor was kind, efficient, and by the end of the appointment I had emergency funds coming and a work coach assigned. "You'll need to start job hunting immediately," she explained. "But given your circumstances, We can make allowances. Have you considered returning to teaching assistants? I had, but the thought of going back to my old school, where people knew me as Marcus's wife, made my stomach turn. I needed something completely separate, a fresh start where nobody knew my history. I'll look at anything, I replied. I just need to work. That afternoon, I walked into a small independent cafe in Clifton called the Bristolian. They had a handwritten sign in the window, "Barista wanted. Inquire within." The owner, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Joanne, looked me up and down with sharp eyes. Ever worked coffee before? No, I admitted. But I'm a fast learner, reliable, and I need this job. Something in my honesty must have resonated. She hired me on the spot, minimum wage, 4 shifts a week to start. It wasn't much, but it was mine, earned through my own effort, deposited into an account only I controlled. I started the next day. The work was harder than I'd expected. My feet ached constantly, my hands were perpetually damp from washing dishes, and the espresso machine seemed determined to humiliate me at every turn. But Joanne was patient, and the other staff were welcoming without prying into why a 34-year-old woman with teaching qualifications was starting as a barista. By Friday, I could make a decent flat white and had stopped dropping cups. The emotional whiplash of the week was staggering. Some moments I felt powerful, liberated, proud of every small step toward independence. Other moments I'd find myself crying in Sandra's bathroom, paralyzed by doubt. Had I overreacted? Could I have tried harder to fix things? Was I throwing away my marriage over one mistake? Then I'd look at the photographs on my phone, the bruises that had finally faded from my face and wrist, and I'd remember. This wasn't one mistake. This was a pattern I'd been too close to see. Sandra never judged my emotional turbulence. She'd simply sit with me during the hard moments, making tea and sharing her own story of leaving. It took me 2 years after I left to stop second-guessing myself, she told me one evening. Your brain is trying to protect you from the pain of accepting what he really was. That's normal. It doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. On Saturday, my first full week of freedom behind me, I walked along the harborside alone. The evening was mild, couples and families strolling past, boats bobbing gently in the water. I bought myself a coffee with my first wages, sat on a bench, and watched the sun set over the Clifton Suspension Bridge. For the first time in 3 years, nobody was monitoring where I was or who I was with. Nobody was questioning my choices or making me account for every penny spent. I could sit here for 5 minutes or 5 hours, and the decision was entirely mine. The relief was so profound it brought tears to my eyes. My phone buzzed. Not Marcus this time, but Helen the solicitor. Divorce papers filed. Marcus served this afternoon. Non-molestation order granted. You're legally protected now. I read the message 3 times, letting the weight of those words settle into my bones. Protected. Free. Mine. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I finished my coffee, stood up, and walked back toward Sandra's house. Back toward the life I was building, one painful, courageous step at a time. 3 months after leaving Marcus, my life had developed a rhythm I barely recognized as my own. The terror of those first weeks had gradually transformed into something steadier, though grief still ambushed me at unexpected moments. I'd moved from 4 shifts at the Bristolian to 5, then 6. Joanne had promoted me to shift supervisor after I'd reorganized the stockroom and implemented a new ordering system that saved her money. The pay increase wasn't enormous, but it meant I could finally contribute properly to Sandra's household expenses without relying entirely on universal credit. You're wasted as a barista, Joanne told me one afternoon whilst we prepped for the evening rush. You've got management written all over you. The compliment settled somewhere deep inside me, filling a space I hadn't realized was hollow. Marcus had spent years convincing me I was incapable of basic competence. Hearing someone recognize my abilities felt like discovering I could breathe underwater. The cafe had become more than just employment. The regulars knew my name now, greeted me warmly, left generous tips. One of them, a carpenter named Owen, came in every morning at 7:30 for the same Americano and actually listened when I made conversation. He was quiet, thoughtful, with paint-stained hands and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. We'd started talking beyond coffee orders, brief exchanges that gradually lengthened into proper conversations. He told me about his teenage daughter, his divorce 3 years ago, his small workshop in Totterdown. "My ex-wife and I are on decent terms now," he'd said one morning. "Took a while to get there, but we both wanted what was best for our daughter." I'd found myself opening up slightly, carefully. "I'm recently divorced too." "Well, still finalizing it technically." He hadn't pried, just nodded understanding. "It's rough, isn't it? Starting over." "Rougher than I expected," I'd admitted. "But better than staying." Something in his expression told me he understood exactly what I meant. Beyond work, I'd started volunteering at the domestic abuse helpline 2 evenings a month. Priya, the counselor who'd helped me during my darkest moment, had suggested it when I'd called to thank her. "Your experience could help other women recognize their situations," she'd said. "Only if you're ready, of course." I'd thought I wasn't ready. But the first time I answered a call from a terrified woman asking if what her husband did counted as abuse, something clicked into place. I knew exactly what to say because I'd asked that same question myself. "Whatever is happening to you is valid," I'd told her, echoing Priya's words to me. "You don't have to justify calling us." Helping others navigate what I'd survived gave my suffering purpose, transformed my trauma into something useful. The divorce was progressing slowly but steadily. Marcus had contested everything initially, demanding I return possessions, claiming I owed him money. His solicitor had sent aggressive letters until Helen calmly demolished each claim with the evidence I'd gathered. The final settlement wasn't generous, but it was enough, £4,800, compensation for the isolation and financial abuse. I'd put half into savings and used the rest for a deposit on a tiny studio flat in St. George. Moving day arrived on a grey Saturday in early autumn. Sandra, Owen, and a few colleagues from the cafe helped me carry my second-hand furniture up 3 flights of stairs. The flat was modest, barely larger than a hotel room, but the lease had my name on it. Mine. Legally, officially, undeniably mine. We ate pizza sitting on the floor, laughing about the wonky IKEA bookshelf Owen had helped assemble. Sandra raised her can of cider in a toast. "To Kira's new beginning. You've earned this." Later, after everyone had left, I stood on my small balcony watching the sun set over Bristol. The city spread before me, full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. My phone rang. Not Marcus, who'd finally stopped trying to contact me. It was my work coach from the job center. "Kira, I've got an interview for you. Teaching assistant position at Redland Primary. They specifically want someone with your experience. Interested?" I looked out at the skyline, at the life I was building brick by careful brick. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm very interested." 6 months had passed since I'd walked out of Marcus's flat with nothing but my handbag. Now, standing in my own studio on a crisp November morning, getting ready for my second week as a teaching assistant at Redland Primary, I barely recognized the woman I'd become. The interview had gone better than I'd dared hope. The headteacher, a warm woman named Mrs. Kapoor, had reviewed my CV and asked gently about the employment gap. I'd been honest, carefully honest, explaining I'd left an abusive marriage and was rebuilding my career. "We need people who understand resilience," she'd said. "Not just teach it." The children had saved me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Their brutal honesty, their uncomplicated affection, their ability to exist entirely in the present moment, it healed something therapy hadn't quite reached. A 6-year-old named Maisie had announced on my first day that I had kind eyes, and I'd nearly cried right there in the classroom. I was combining teaching with weekend shifts at the Bristolian, exhausting myself but finally building proper savings. The account that had once held £340 now had nearly £2,000. Not wealth, but security, breathing room, proof I could survive independently. My friendship with Owen had deepened gradually, naturally. He'd started texting occasionally, sending photographs of furniture he was building or asking if I wanted to grab dinner sometime. I'd been terrified to say yes, terrified of rushing into anything, terrified my judgment was still broken from Marcus. But I'd said yes anyway. Our first proper date had been wonderfully ordinary. A walk along the Avon, fish and chips eaten on a bench, easy conversation that flowed without effort. When he'd reached to hold my hand, I'd flinched instinctively, and he'd immediately pulled back. "I'm sorry," I'd whispered, ashamed. "It's not you, it's just." "You don't need to explain," he'd interrupted gently. "We move at whatever pace feels right for you. No pressure, Kira. I promise." That patience, that respect for my boundaries, meant more than he could possibly know. Marcus had never asked what I wanted, never cared about my comfort. Owen made consent feel natural rather than negotiated. We'd been seeing each other for 2 months now, slowly, carefully. He'd met Sandra, who'd given her cautious approval. I'd met his daughter Lucy, a sharp 15-year-old who'd assessed me with teenage skepticism before deciding I was acceptable. "Dad's been happier since he met you," she told me bluntly during our second meeting. "Don't mess him about." "I won't," I'd promised, and meant it. But I'd also been honest with Owen about my limitations. "I'm not ready to move in together or make big commitments. I need to keep my independence." "I understand completely," he'd replied. "I like my space too. Let's just enjoy what we have without rushing toward anything." The lack of pressure was liberating. This relationship existed without timelines or expectations, just mutual affection and respect. Meanwhile, I'd become a regular speaker at domestic abuse awareness events, sharing my story to help others recognize warning signs. Standing in community centers and church halls, telling rooms full of strangers about coercive control and financial abuse, I'd discovered a voice I never knew I possessed. After one presentation, a young woman had approached me, trembling. "Everything you described, that's happening to me right now." I thought I was going mad. I'd given her the helpline number, watched recognition and relief wash over her face, and known with absolute certainty that my suffering had purpose. The divorce had finally been finalized in October. I'd received the decree absolute in the post, that official document declaring my marriage legally dissolved. I'd expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I'd felt a complicated mixture of grief and relief, mourning not what Marcus actually was, but what I desperately hoped he might be. Sandra had found me crying over the paperwork. "It's okay to be sad," she'd said, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You're not mourning him. You're mourning the life you thought you'd have." She was right, as usual. Now, locking my flat and heading to work on a Monday morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not wild happiness, not euphoria, just steady, solid satisfaction with the life I'd built. My phone buzzed with a text from Owen. "Good luck with the literacy group today. Fancy dinner at mine tomorrow?" "Lucy's with her mum." I smiled, typing back a quick yes before heading to the bus stop. The future still felt uncertain, fragile in places, but it was mine to shape. And that made all the difference. Nearly a year after leaving Marcus, I finally understood what people meant when they talked about healing not being linear. Some days I felt invincible, strong, completely certain of the choices I'd made. Other days, trauma would surge up from nowhere, dragging me back to that kitchen where everything shattered. It happened on a Tuesday evening at Owen's house. We'd been seeing each other for 5 months now, our relationship progressing with the careful slowness of two people who'd both been burned before. He'd cooked dinner, something simple but thoughtful, and we'd settled on his sofa afterward to watch a film. When he reached over to hold my hand, something in the gesture triggered a memory I couldn't control. Marcus grabbing my wrist, his fingers digging into my skin, the casual violence disguised as affection. My body reacted before my brain could intervene, flinching away violently, my breathing suddenly rapid and shallow. Owen immediately pulled back, concern flooding his face. "Kira, are you okay?" I couldn't speak, couldn't explain the panic flooding through me. It was irrational, I knew it was irrational. Owen had never been anything but gentle, patient, respectful. But my nervous system didn't care about logic. "I'm sorry," I finally managed, my voice shaking. "I don't know why that happened. You didn't do anything wrong." "Hey, you don't need to apologize." He shifted slightly, giving me more space without making it obvious. "Do you want to talk about it, or would you rather I just sit here quietly?" The fact that he'd asked, that he'd given me control over the situation rather than assuming what I needed, made something in my chest loosen slightly. "Just sit," I whispered. "Please." We sat in silence for several minutes, the television playing unwatched in the background. Gradually, my breathing steadied, the panic receding like a tide pulling back from shore. "I thought I was past this," I said eventually. "It's been months since I've had a flashback that intense." "Trauma doesn't follow a schedule," Owen replied gently. "My therapist told me that after my divorce. Some days you're fine, some days something random sets you off. Doesn't mean you're not making progress." I looked at him properly then, this kind man who'd somehow become essential to my healing without ever demanding more than I could give. "You went to therapy?" "For 2 years after my marriage ended. Best decision I ever made." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know what you went through was different from my situation. But if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. And if you don't, that's fine too." The permission to have boundaries, to not perform recovery on anyone's timeline but my own, was exactly what I needed to hear. We talked for hours that night. I told him things I'd never fully articulated before, about the gradual erosion of myself during my marriage, the way Marcus had made me question my own reality. Owen listened without trying to fix anything, without offering platitudes, just bearing witness to my pain. "I'm terrified of making the same mistakes," I admitted. "Of missing red flags again, of trusting the wrong person." "That's understandable," he said. "But Kira, you're not the same person who married Marcus. You've learned things about yourself, about what you will and won't accept. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because you're scared." He was right. I wasn't that desperate 29-year-old anymore, searching for belonging in another person. I'd found belonging in myself first, built a life that existed independently of any relationship. "I really like you," I told him, the words feeling vulnerable but necessary. "But I need you to know that I might be difficult sometimes. That I might pull away when I don't mean to, that this might be messier than a normal relationship." Owen smiled, that gentle crinkle appearing around his eyes. "I don't think there's any such thing as a normal relationship. We're both carrying baggage. The difference is we're choosing to be honest about it." Something shifted between us that night, a deepening of trust that had nothing to do with physical intimacy and everything to do with emotional safety. A week later, I had my first session with a trauma counselor that Helen had recommended. I'd been resistant to therapy, worried it would make me seem weak or broken. But sitting in that quiet office, finally processing years of suppressed pain with someone trained to help, I realized seeking support wasn't weakness. It was the bravest thing I'd done yet. The counselor, a woman named Dr. Patel, helped me understand that my body's reaction to Owen's touch wasn't failure. It was my nervous system trying to protect me, a survival mechanism that had kept me safe. "Healing means teaching your body that you're safe now," she explained. "That takes time and patience." I was learning both. 1 year and 3 months after walking out of Marcus's flat, I stood on the harborside where I'd sat so many times during those early, terrifying weeks. The anniversary had arrived quietly, without the fanfare I'd somehow expected, just another Saturday in February with pale winter sunlight reflecting off the water. So much had changed it felt like remembering a different person's life. I'd been promoted to senior teaching assistant at Redland Primary, leading literacy interventions and mentoring new staff. The head teacher had pulled me aside last week to suggest I consider training as a qualified teacher. "You're a natural," Mrs. Kapoor had said. "The children adore you, and you understand how to reach the ones who struggle." I was seriously considering it. Evening courses, student loans, the whole terrifying prospect of believing I was capable of more than I'd been told I deserved. My studio flat had become a proper home, filled with second-hand furniture I'd chosen myself, plants that somehow survived my irregular watering, photographs of people who genuinely cared about me. Sandra visited regularly, our friendship having evolved into something like sisterhood. Owen's daughter Lucy had started texting me directly, asking advice about school and boys with teenage earnestness that made me feel trusted and valued. Owen himself had become a steady, comfortable presence in my life. We'd had the conversation about moving in together last month. I'd said maybe, eventually, But I wasn't ready to give up my independence yet. He'd understood completely, hadn't pushed or sulked, just smiled and said, "You're flat, your timeline. I'm not going anywhere." That patience, that lack of pressure, meant everything. My work with the domestic abuse helpline had expanded. I was now a trained volunteer supervisor, supporting newer counselors and speaking regularly at awareness events. Last week, I'd received an email from a woman I'd mentored 6 months ago. "I left him. I'm out. I got my own flat and my kids are safe. Thank you for showing me it was possible." I'd read that message 3 times, tears streaming down my face, understanding finally that my suffering had created something valuable. Every painful step of my journey had become a roadmap for someone else's escape. The divorce settlement money was long gone, invested in my flat deposit and therapy and building a life. But I'd replaced it through my own work, my own effort. My savings account held over £5,000 now. Not wealth, but safety, choices, freedom from desperation. I thought about my younger self sometimes, that girl in foster care desperately seeking belonging, willing to accept scraps of affection disguised as love. I wished I could tell her that home wasn't something you found in another person's approval. It was something you built inside yourself first. My phone buzzed. Owen, asking if I wanted to come over for Sunday lunch tomorrow. Lucy would be there, and he'd promised to attempt roast potatoes without burning them. I smiled, typing back a yes. Behind me, the city hummed with life, full of people carrying their own invisible struggles and quiet victories. Somewhere in Bristol, a woman was probably making the same desperate calculations I'd made in that bathroom with a bruised face, wondering if she had the strength to leave. I pulled out my own phone and posted to the domestic abuse support group I joined during my darkest days. 1 year ago today, I walked away from everything I thought was my life. It was terrifying. It was painful. It was the best decision I ever made. If you're reading this and wondering if you can do it too, you can. You're stronger than you know. I pocketed my phone and started walking toward the bus stop, toward Owen's house, toward the Sunday lunch and easy laughter and uncomplicated affection that had become my normal. The future still held uncertainty. I didn't know if Owen and I would last, if my teaching career would flourish, if I'd ever stop flinching occasionally at unexpected touches. But I knew with absolute certainty that I was free. That I'd saved myself. That the woman who'd stumbled out of that bathroom with a bruised face had found her way home. And home, I'd finally learned, was wherever I chose to build it.